The 13th century BCE unfolds as a decisive moment in the history of the ancient Near East. Across Anatolia and Mesopotamia, the great powers that shaped the late Bronze Age stand under mounting pressure. Trade routes falter, vassal states grow restless, regional alliances shift with increasing speed. In this tightening world, two empires, with long memories and rising ambitions, move toward a conflict neither can avoid. The Hittite Empire, long established in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, faces a challenge to its authority in the borderlands of northern Syria. Its territories there depend on loyalty from cities and rulers who now question whether Hattusa can still protect them. At the same time, Assyria expands with unprecedented discipline. Its armies push westward through the former lands of Mitanni, bringing new regions under firm control and projecting strength into areas claimed by the Hittites for generations. The frontier between the two powers becomes increasingly unstable. Reports of Assyrian advances, shifting allegiances, and defiant local rulers reach the Hittite court with growing urgency. What begins as diplomatic competition evolves into a struggle for dominance over regions essential to both empires' security and prestige. By around 1245 BCE, armies on both sides march with purpose. Their routes converge toward Nihriya, a region whose narrow passes and open plains leave little room for maneuver. The stage for a decisive battle is set, not by sudden provocation, but by the gradual, unavoidable logic of imperial rivalry. This is the story of the Battle of Nihriya. The conflict at Nihriya emerged from a broader landscape defined by shifting power, fragile alliances, and the slow erosion of the systems that had long supported the late Bronze Age world. For more than a century, the great powers relied on treaties, diplomacy, and vassal networks to maintain stability across the Near East. Yet beneath this structure, the region grew increasingly volatile. By the mid-13th century BCE, the forces that once balanced one another had begun to drift out of alignment. The Hittite Empire stood at the western edge of this changing world. Its authority reached deep into northern Syria, a region that formed the backbone of its southern domains. Cities such as Carchemish, Aleppo, and the smaller kingdoms of Nuhasa and Amurru were tied to Hittite power through treaties that demanded loyalty but relied heavily on perception, the belief that the great king of Hatti could protect his subjects and punish defiance. In earlier generations, this belief had been well supported, but now, distance, internal strain, and external threats created fractures in the foundation of Hittite influence. Assyria, in contrast, rose with steady and deliberate momentum. Once held in check by the Mitanni kingdom, it expanded dramatically after conquering Hanagalbat. This conquest removed the buffer that had long separated Assyria from Hittite-controlled Syria. With its borders now directly touching contested lands, Assyria's ambitions turned westward. The kingdom reorganized its newly won territories, placing governors and troops in strategic locations to solidify control. Each administrative reform strengthened Assyria's presence, giving it the leverage to influence local rulers who had previously answered to Hatti. The Syrian buffer zone, stretching across Hanagalbat, Nuhasa, and the upper Euphrates, became the center of a growing rivalry. These lands were not merely geographic margins. They formed the economic and military lifelines for both empires. Whoever controlled them commanded crucial trade routes linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Fertile plains and river valleys supported agriculture and provided access to timber, horses, and metals. In strategic terms, the region determined the depth of each empire's defensive reach. For Hatti, losing Syria meant exposing the Anatolian heartland. For Assyria, securing it meant unlocking the west. This environment bred instability. Vassal states responded to the shifting balance with increasing caution. Some rulers, seeing Assyria's rapid rise, began sending messages eastward, seeking protection or more favorable alliances. Others attempted to maintain loyalty to Hatti while negotiating quietly with Assyrian agents. Letters from the period reflect a world of hesitant commitments and veiled threats, an international order trying to sustain itself as the conditions that supported it unraveled. Rebellions broke out in several regions, further complicating the political landscape. Small uprisings might have been manageable in earlier decades, but now they took place amid failing harvests, strained resources, and competing imperial demands. Hittite officials found themselves compelled to respond to multiple crises at once, often too slowly to prevent further deterioration. Every lapse of authority encouraged neighboring rulers to reconsider their obligations. Assyria's ambitions added a new level of urgency. Shalmaneser I and his successors viewed the West not as a distant frontier, but as the natural extension of Assyrian control. Their military campaigns demonstrated a capability for sustained operations beyond their traditional borders. In contrast, the Hittite Empire struggled to mobilize quickly over long distances, and its commitments across Anatolia limited the forces it could spare for Syria. The imbalance in momentum became increasingly visible. As both powers maneuvered for advantage, the underlying cause of conflict sharpened into clarity. Each sought dominance over the same strategic corridor in northern Syria. The region could not serve two masters. Once vassal states began openly shifting allegiance, both empires recognized that only a decisive show of force could resolve the question of supremacy. By the early 1240s BCE, diplomacy had given way to preparation. Assyria strengthened its positions in the former Mitanni lands. Hatti mobilized to reassert its waning influence. Neither empire desired a drawn-out confrontation, yet both understood that failing to act would invite greater losses. Regional instability had pushed them to the brink. The path toward Nihriya was set long before armies marched. It formed through years of shifting loyalties, internal pressures, and the unavoidable collision of two expanding spheres of influence. The battle would not decide who provoked whom. It would decide who still had the strength to shape the future of the Near East. The Hittite Empire entered the mid-13th century BCE, carrying the weight of an aging power. For centuries, Hatti had stood among the dominant states of the Near East, capable of matching Egypt, Mitanni, and Babylonia through diplomacy and on the battlefield. Yet by the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta IV, the empire's strengths were increasingly shadowed by accumulating weaknesses, pressures that narrowed its strategic options and deepened its reliance on territories far from the Anatolian core. Tukulti-Ninurta IV inherited a realm shaped by both triumph and strain. His father, Hattusili III, had restored stability after years of dynastic turmoil and secured peace with Egypt through a landmark treaty. But although this agreement calmed one frontier, it did nothing to resolve the challenges facing the heart of the empire. The plateau around Hattusa, rugged and demanding, produced limited agricultural surpluses. Periodic shortages forced Hatti to depend on grain shipments from its southern provinces. When these shipments faltered, even the royal court felt the consequences. Internal unrest reflected these pressures. Letters preserved from the period reveal officials pleading for supplies, describing food scarcity severe enough to disrupt administrative routines. Such instability weakened the trust between the central government and the vassal states, whose loyalty supported Hittite authority across Syria. A ruler struggling to feed his own cities could not easily demand absolute obedience from distant subjects balancing their own survival. Diplomatic pressure added further strain. The Syrian vassals, Carchemish, Aleppo, Nuhasa, and others, formed the backbone of Hittite influence beyond Anatolia. These territories were not only symbolic claims, they were essential for trade, agriculture, and strategic depth. Yet their loyalty depended on Hatti demonstrating strength. As Assyria grew more assertive, the balance that once favored the Hittites shifted. Some vassals delayed tribute. Others communicated discreetly with Assyrian officials. A few openly defied Hittite commands, confident that Assyria's rise offered an alternative source of protection. Tukulti-Ninurta faced these developments with limited resources. The empire's wide geography demanded constant attention. In the north, the Kaska tribes raided Hittite lands with persistent hostility. In the west, independent Anatolian states required monitoring. Each distraction reduced the forces available for Syria, creating openings for Assyrian influence to expand. The Hittite military structure, though formidable, reflected the stresses of the era. The empire relied heavily on its chariot corps, a symbol of Hittite power since the days of Tukulti-Ninurta I. These heavy chariots required trained crews, specialized equipment, and strong horses, all costly assets for a state experiencing economic strain. The infantry, drawn from Anatolian towns and subject territories, remained capable but required reliable leaders and coherent supply lines. Mobilizing these forces over long distances strained the administrative system and exposed the army to shortages during prolonged campaigns. Coordinating this diverse army became increasingly difficult as regional conditions worsened. Some vassal rulers, uncertain of Hittite strength, fulfilled their military obligations reluctantly or inconsistently. Others withheld troops altogether, forcing the central command to rely more heavily on the Anatolian corps. The logistical demands of marching southward through difficult terrain added further challenges. By the time a Hittite army reached Syria, it often did so with its resources partly exhausted. Diplomatically, Tukulti-Ninurta attempted to reinforce Hittite authority. He reaffirmed the empire's commitments, demanded renewed loyalty from wavering vassals, and issued instructions aimed at stabilizing the southern frontier. But diplomacy required leverage, and leverage depended on credible strength. The more Assyria advanced, the more the Hittites faced a dilemma: act decisively or accept the erosion of their influence. Hadi could not afford to retreat. Losing Syria would reduce the empire to its Anatolian heartland, stripping it of wealth, prestige, and the buffer zones essential for its defense. Thus, even as internal strains mounted, Tukulti-Ninurta recognized the necessity of confronting Assyria's expansion directly. The Hittite world before Nihriya was therefore one of urgency, a landscape where an empire sought to preserve its identity against forces that pressed from without and eroded from within. The march toward battle was not chosen lightly. It emerged from the realization that without decisive action, the empire that had endured for centuries might soon find its position irreversibly diminished. While the Hittite Empire struggled to maintain cohesion across its vast territories, Assyria entered the 13th century BCE with accelerating momentum. Once a regional kingdom overshadowed by Mitanni and Babylon, Assyria had transformed itself into a rising imperial force through calculated campaigns and administrative reforms that reshaped its political landscape. By the reign of Shalmaneser I, Assyria stood no longer as a kingdom seeking survival, but as a power seeking expansion. Assyria's foundations differed fundamentally from those of Hadi. Centered along the fertile Tigris River, the Assyrian heartland benefited from abundant agriculture, enabling stable population growth and consistent resource production. These advantages supported a standing army capable of mobilizing quickly, supplying itself efficiently, and campaigning across multiple seasons. Unlike the broad, rugged expanse of the Hittite Plateau, Assyria's geography allowed for tighter administrative control and faster communication between provinces. The conquest of Hanagalbat marked a turning point. This region, once the core of the Mitanni kingdom, had served for generations as the buffer separating Assyria from Hittite-controlled Syria. When Shalmaneser I absorbed Hanagalbat, he eliminated that buffer entirely. Assyria now bordered territories that Hadi considered essential to its imperial identity. The new frontier placed Assyrian governors and garrisons in positions where they could direct influence and pressure deep into the contested lands of northern Syria. Assyrian administration reinforced this expansion. The kingdom implemented provincial systems designed to integrate conquered territories into the state's political and economic framework. Governors reported directly to the king, ensuring loyalty and reducing the autonomy that had once allowed regions to shift allegiance. Agricultural production, tribute, and manpower from these territories supported further military operations. With each campaign, Assyria strengthened both its reach and its internal stability. Central to this transformation was the Assyrian army. Shaped by reforms and consistent training, it became one of the most efficient military forces of its time. Assyrian infantry operated in tightly coordinated units, capable of disciplined maneuvers on open plains and fortified terrain alike. Their chariots, lighter and more maneuverable than the Hittite heavy chariot corps, excelled in speed, flanking movement, and ranged attacks. This mobility allowed Assyrian commanders to shape battlefields to their advantage and exploit weaknesses in enemy formations. Logistics enhanced Assyria's strength. The kingdom's administrative centers supported reliable supply chains that enabled armies to operate far from home with fewer interruptions. Roads and way stations facilitated communication and troop movement. This logistical infrastructure, rare in the ancient world, allowed Assyria to maintain prolonged campaigns in the west while preserving stability in its heartland. Assyria's westward strategy was deliberate rather than impulsive. Shalmaneser I recognized that controlling northern Syria would secure access to trade routes, agricultural regions, and strategic corridors leading toward the Mediterranean. The conquest of these lands would also weaken Hitti's position, reducing the influence of a rival empire whose control of the region depended on the fragile loyalty of its vassals. To achieve this, Assyria employed not only military force, but also political pressure. Assyrian envoys communicated with local rulers, offering protection or demanding allegiance. Intelligence networks provided detailed reports about shifting loyalties, internal disputes, and vulnerabilities within Hittite-controlled territories. These networks allowed Assyria to intervene swiftly when local rulers hesitated or rebelled, presenting itself as a reliable and increasingly dominant alternative to Hittite oversight. Assyrian inscriptions from the period emphasized the kingdom's expanding scope. They record victories, conquests, and administrative reorganizations with precise confidence, presenting a narrative of inevitable ascent. While royal inscriptions often magnified achievements, the archaeological and textual evidence confirms a period of rapid and sustained growth. By the early 1240s BCE, Assyria had established itself as the strongest power east of the Euphrates. Its armies were experienced, its administration cohesive, and its ambitions clearly defined. The westward push was no longer simply an opportunity. It had become a strategic imperative. As Assyria advanced, Hitti faced mounting pressure to defend its Syrian holdings. The forces that had once kept the two empires apart had dissolved. Geography, politics, and ambition now drew them toward the same contested frontier. The rise of Assyria set the stage for confrontation. At Nihriya, the momentum of a growing empire would meet the resolve of an older one, determined to preserve its place in the Near East. The march toward Nihriya began long before the armies caught sight of one another. It unfolded across a landscape shaped by geography, divided loyalties, and the slow momentum of two empires moving toward the same frontier. Once Assyria's westward expansion crossed into territories claimed by the Hittites, coordinated movement on both sides became unavoidable. What followed was not a sudden rush to battle, but a deliberate convergence shaped by strategy and necessity. The Hittite army mobilized first. From the Anatolian plateau, troops assembled in fortified cities before moving southward through rugged mountain passes. These routes, carved through steep ridges and narrow valleys, slowed progress and demanded careful organization. Chariot teams, infantry units, and supply caravans traveled together in a long, staggered column. The march revealed the challenges of distance that had always constrained Hittite power. Every mile placed further strain on food stores, horses, and the cohesion of an already stretched force. Yet the strategic importance of the campaign left no room for hesitation. Tukulti-Ninurta IV understood that failure to reinforce the Syrian frontier would invite further defections and strengthen Assyria's position. Each town the army passed watched carefully, weighing whether the Hittites still commanded the strength to protect them. Some vassal rulers offered supplies and support, reaffirming loyalty out of necessity. Others hesitated, sending cautious messages to both empires to avoid choosing prematurely. A few defected openly, aligning themselves with Assyria before the Hittite forces arrived. Assyria, advancing from the east, moved with greater speed. Its armies departed from well-supplied centers in Hanagalbat, crossing territories recently reorganized under firm Assyrian control. Roads and fortified outposts provided secure staging points that simplified the movement of troops and provisions. Scouts ranged ahead of the main column, gathering intelligence on Hittite positions, local loyalties, and the terrain that lay between them and the contested lands of northern Syria. As both armies drew closer to the frontier, the geopolitical atmosphere grew tense. In the towns and villages between them, fear and uncertainty became common. Local rulers understood that a decisive conflict was imminent. Farmers hid grain reserves. Merchants halted their caravans, waiting to see which army would control key routes. Messengers hurried along the river valleys, carrying reports that contributed to a growing sense that the world around them was entering a new phase of instability. Terrain played a decisive role in shaping the army's paths. The region near Nihriya, its precise location still debated, lay along the transitional zone where river plains met rising foothills. The Euphrates and its tributaries created channels that both guided movement and restricted maneuvering. Armies advancing from opposite directions had limited options for positioning. Narrow crossings and open plains funneled their routes toward predictable points. Even without direct communication, both forces were drawn by the landscape into a narrowing corridor. Pre-battle escalations began long before the armies met. Assyrian patrols probed westward, testing the boundaries of Hittite control. Hittite scouts shadowed these movements, sending reports back to their commanders. Small skirmishes erupted at crossroads or water sources, not large enough to determine the outcome of the campaign, but sufficient to reveal the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. These encounters heightened the urgency on each side, sharpening plans for the battle that approached. The tension intensified as defections continued. Some Hittite vassals, calculating that Assyria offered better protection or greater stability, refused to contribute troops to Tukulti-Ninurta's army. Their absence forced the Hittites to rely more heavily on forces drawn from the core regions of Anatolia. In contrast, Assyria benefited from the support of newly loyal territories whose resources supplied the campaign. By the time both armies neared the same landscape, the momentum of the march made the coming clash inevitable. The Hittites approached from the northwest, weary from long travel, yet determined to reassert control. The Assyrians advanced from the east, confident in their organization and recent victories. Between them stretched the open plain near Nihriya, a region whose strategic position left little room for avoidance. The convergence that had taken shape gradually now accelerated toward a single point. The march to the battlefield ended not with hesitation, but with a clear recognition. Control of this region would be decided not by treaties or shifting loyalties, but by the outcome of a confrontation that neither side could afford to lose. Morning rises over the contested plain near Nihriya, casting muted light across the landscape where two empires now face one another. Dust hangs in the still air, unsettled by the movement of soldiers preparing for war. The terrain stretches wide and uneven, open ground broken by low ridges, shallow riverbeds, and hardened paths carved by caravans crossing this frontier for generations. Today, those paths serve a different purpose. They guide two armies toward a confrontation neither can avoid. The Hittite army forms first, assembling in long, deliberate lines. Infantry units tighten their formations, shields interlocked, spears angled forward. These soldiers carry the memory of an empire that has endured for centuries, though the weight of its recent struggles lingers in the set of their shoulders. Behind them, the Hittite chariot corps, the symbol of Hittite military tradition, positions itself for the charge. Their heavy frames rest on broad wheels, each chariot carrying a crew trained to deliver concentrated shock at the decisive moment. Horses stamp the ground, restless under the tension that precedes battle. Across the plain, the Assyrian army responds with calm, disciplined precision. Infantry units form layered ranks, creating depth and cohesion. Archers prepare their bows, adjusting their stance for range and accuracy. Light chariots glide into position along the flanks, their smaller frames designed for speed and maneuverability. Assyrian officers observe the terrain, noting where the ground rises, where the soil softens, where the enemy might overextend. Their preparations reflect a system refined through years of expansion and organized warfare. The air stills. Then the Assyrians advance. Archers step forward and release the first volley. Arrows cut through the sky in dark arcs, descending upon the Hittite front line. Shields rise, spears brace. The impact thuds across the formation. The barrage does not break the Hittite ranks, but it signals the rhythm of the battle to come. Precise, relentless, methodical. The Hittite response arrives in motion. Heavy chariots surge forward, wheels pounding the earth, dust rising behind them in long, curling plumes. Their speed and weight create a rolling wave of momentum aimed directly at the Assyrian front. Hittite commanders rely on this tactic. Break the opposing formations early, disrupt cohesion, and create openings for infantry to exploit. The chariot charge embodies the tradition of Hittite warfare, a decisive strike meant to turn battles swiftly. The Assyrians meet it with coordination rather than brute force. Light chariots sweep along the flanks, maintaining distance, releasing arrows with practiced timing. Their crews maneuver nimbly, avoiding direct collision while harassing the advancing Hittites. Behind them, Assyrian infantry tighten their lines, bracing for the impact. The contrast between the two forces becomes clear: power against precision, weight against speed. The first, collisions erupt along the center. Hittite chariots crash into the Assyrian shield wall, splintering shields and scattering soldiers. The force of the impact sends shockwaves through the Assyrian formation, yet the ranks close quickly, absorbing the blow. Assyrian spearmen thrust forward, targeting the exposed legs of horses, striking at the structure of the chariots themselves. The charge loses some of its cohesion as several vehicles swerve or slow. Arrows rain down once more, this time focused on the advancing chariots. Assyrian archers aim not at the crews, but at the horses and the wheels. Targets that once compromised render even the strongest chariot ineffective. A few chariots falter, their momentum broken. Others press on but struggle to maintain alignment. The Hittite infantry advances behind the remnants of the charge. Shielded and determined, they press into the Assyrian front line. Metal clashes in tight formation as spear meets shield and the two armies lock in close combat. Dust thickens around them, obscuring shapes and movement. The ground, once level and open, becomes churned by the weight of fighting. Along the flanks, the Assyrians seize the opportunity created by the disrupted Hittite charge. Light chariots accelerate, sweeping behind isolated Hittite units, threatening encirclement. Their mobility allows them to strike quickly and withdraw, avoiding direct confrontation while inflicting steady pressure. Hittite forces attempt to counter, but their heavier chariots cannot match the speed and flexibility of their opponents. As midday approaches, the heat intensifies the strain. Sweat drips from helmets. Shields grow heavy with repeated blows. The Hittite infantry presses forward with resolve, yet the Assyrians respond with coordinated rotations, fresh soldiers stepping into the front while fatigued ones fall back without breaking formation. Every adjustment reinforces their cohesion. The turning point emerges gradually. A gap opens in the Hittite line, not wide, but deep enough for Assyrian commanders to exploit. The cause is simple. Uneven terrain disrupts one unit's positioning, creating a seam between formations. Assyrian infantry push into the opening with decisive force, widening it step by step. Light chariots enter the breach, scattering Hittite soldiers who attempt to regroup. The Hittite center begins to buckle. Commanders signal for reinforcement, but their heavy chariots, once the pride of their army, cannot reposition quickly enough. Infantry units struggle to compress the widening gap. Meanwhile, archers along the Assyrian rear continue to deliver controlled volleys, targeting vulnerable clusters of Hittite troops. On the flanks, the pressure mounts. Some vassal contingents, their loyalties already uncertain, hesitate to engage fully. Their reluctance creates uneven support along the line, allowing Assyrian units to penetrate deeper. The psychological weight of the battle shifts. Assyrian soldiers advance. With rising confidence, Hittite formations begin to lose their cohesion. By early afternoon, the fragmentation becomes irreversible. The Assyrians break through the center entirely, splitting the Hittite army into isolated groups. Chariots trapped by terrain or enemy maneuvering attempt to retreat, but find their paths blocked. Infantry units, cut off from the main body, fight desperately but without the unified structure necessary to hold the field. The Assyrian advance remains measured, avoiding overextension while maintaining constant pressure. Their discipline prevents the chaos that often follows a breakthrough. Each movement is calculated to restrict the Hittite retreat and prevent any attempt at reformation. The sun tilts westward, casting long shadows across the plain. In this light, the final collapse unfolds. Hittite forces withdraw toward the ridges and riverbanks, abandoning the field as Assyrian troops secure the ground behind them. The resistance weakens into scattered pockets of fighting, then dissipates entirely. By late afternoon, the battle is decided. The Assyrian army stands in control of Nihriya. The Hittite formations that march south to defend their influence have fractured under sustained, coordinated assault. The dust of the battlefield settles slowly over broken weapons and trampled earth. What remains is not simply the memory of a battle, but the imprint of a decisive shift in power. The Battle of Nihriya ends with a single, unmistakable conclusion. Assyria has demonstrated the strength to dominate the northern frontier, and the Hittite Empire has suffered a blow from which it will struggle to recover. When the dust settled over the plain of Nihriya, the consequences emerged with a clarity more devastating than the battle itself. The Assyrian army stood victorious, organized, disciplined, and firmly in control of the field. The Hittite forces, fractured and exhausted, retreated in scattered bands toward fortified cities or back across the long roads to the Anatolian plateau. What had begun as an attempt to defend a fading frontier ended as a revelation of the deeper weaknesses that had accumulated within the Hittite Empire over decades. The defeat carried immediate political shock. Hittite authority in northern Syria depended on the belief that the great king of Hatti could safeguard his vassals and enforce loyalty. Nihriya shattered that belief. Cities that once balanced between the great powers now acted decisively. Some aligned themselves with Assyria, seeking protection under a rising force. Others declared independence, convinced that Hittite oversight no longer held weight. Confidence in Hatti collapsed faster than the empire could respond. Assyria moved swiftly to fill the vacuum. Shalmaneser I and his successors fortified their hold over the former Mitanni lands, secured key routes, and integrated Syrian territories into a growing administrative network. Tribute systems, garrisons, and newly appointed governors reshaped regional politics, signaling to local rulers that the momentum of power had shifted decisively eastward. The message was unmistakable. The future now belonged to the state that had demonstrated its strength at Nihriya. Diplomatically, the defeat weakened Hatti's standing across the Near East. Treaties relied on credible enforcement, and after Nihriya, that credibility faltered. Hittite envoys continued to negotiate, but neighboring states recognized the empire's diminishing capacity to project force. The loss of northern Syria exposed the Anatolian heartland, placing additional strain on a realm already grappling with resource shortages, internal unrest, and mounting threats along other borders. Nihriya did not destroy the Hittite Empire outright, but it accelerated its decline. The battle revealed the limits of a power stretched thin, dependent on distant provinces for stability, and increasingly vulnerable to wider disruptions that would soon sweep through the late Bronze Age world. Within a few decades, the combined pressures of famine, migration, and regional collapse would overwhelm Hatti entirely. Assyria, meanwhile, emerged from the battle with strengthened resolve. The victory confirmed the effectiveness of its military reforms and the advantages of its centralized administration. The foundations laid in this period, control over Hanagalbat, influence in Syria, and the confidence gained through victory, would become the bedrock of the later Neo-Assyrian Empire, which would dominate the Near East with unprecedented authority. Viewed within the broader context of an age approaching collapse, Nihriya stands as one of the decisive fractures in an overstressed system. It did not cause the turmoil that followed, but it revealed its inevitability. On this contested frontier, an aging empire faltered, and a rising one asserted its place in a transforming world. The dust of Nihriya settled long ago, but its legacy endures, marking the moment when the balance of the late Bronze Age shifted and history turned toward a new order.